Don't leave now. I'm going to tell you real cemetery stories that will give you chills. Sit down and get your popcorn.
Some people think every cemetery is silent, but after 26 years dealing with death, I've learned there's more than one kind of silence. There's the silence of peace, and then there's the one that whispers in your ear as if something still needs to be said, an emptiness that seems to pull you in. I only truly understood this last spring when I buried what should have been just another body, but which turned into the beginning of my worst nightmare. His name was David Harper. Young, 21 years old, a decorated U.S. Army soldier, killed in the line of duty, a standard military funeral. Flag folded, 3 rifle shots, trumpet playing taps as his mother collapsed to the ground. I thought it would be just another one of those heartbreaking but predictable funerals. I was wrong, so wrong that to this day I catch myself looking over my shoulder when I pass the graves at night. It was there, that very late afternoon, when no one was left, that I felt a slight tremor beneath my feet, as if the newly closed coffin had given a small jump from the grave. At that moment I froze. Maybe it was all in my head, or maybe not. But that night, the silence of the cemetery didn't feel like peace. It felt like a warning. And what happened the next night was even more disturbing. And if you've ever felt like silence could hide something, maybe this story is for you. Stay with me until the end. And if this gives you goosebumps like it did me, you'll know it's worth subscribing and following the next stories, because this is just the beginning. The night after the funeral, something prevented me from leaving at the usual time. The last cigarette had gone too quickly, the coffee in the thermos was cold, and the back gate jammed as if to keep me there for a few more minutes. That's when I decided to walk to the row where we'd buried young Harper, partly out of curiosity, partly because of that nagging feeling that something wasn't quite finished. And it was at that moment that I felt it again, that same faint tremor underfoot, as if something were trying to move beneath the earth. At first, I thought it was an animal burrowing underneath, but the surrounding graves were intact. I returned the next night, this time with an audio recorder discreetly tucked into my coat. I hid a few feet from the grave, among the pine trees that line the eastern edge of the cemetery. The clock read 3:11 a.m. when the ground shook for the 3rd time. This time, however, the sound was accompanied by a sharp crack, like wood being forced from within. I froze. I reviewed the audio in the morning. There were no voices, just a muffled knocking sound, repeated 3 times. That afternoon, while patrolling, I noticed something that didn't make sense. The flag left on the headstone was no longer folded in a triangle. It was stretched out, open, as if someone had carefully unfolded it. I thought it might have been vandalized, but none of the cameras had been activated. And even stranger, the flowers the mother had left were wilted, but not from time. It looked like someone had pressed each petal with their fingers. That's when the dreams began. Always the same scenario. A cloudy night, the cemetery empty, and a soldier standing motionless before his own grave, always with his back turned, silent, as if awaiting orders that never came. But what made me understand that it was more than a simple nightmare was what I saw with my own eyes on the 3rd night. And when I tell you what appeared there, on the other side of the tombstone, you'll understand why I almost gave up working there forever. On the 3rd night, I couldn't sleep. The clock read 2:45 a.m. when I decided to leave the house and return to the cemetery. It wasn't part of my shift. No one was waiting for me there, but the feeling that something was repeating itself, like a nocturnal cycle stuck at the same time, wouldn't leave me alone. I entered through the back door, turned off all the lights in the hallway outside, and walked slowly, flashlight off, feeling the damp chill of the freshly disturbed earth. I can't explain why, but something inside me already knew that this would be the night everything would change. I hid behind the ancient mausoleum, which has a direct view of the row where the soldier had been buried. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that seems to listen to you from within. When the clock struck 3:12, I saw him. He was there, standing, exactly as in the dream, his back turned, standing at attention, dressed from head to toe in uniform. But it wasn't the same uniform worn at recent burials. That uniform was old, with insignia the army hadn't used in at least 2 decades. And there was one detail that chilled my blood. His right shoulder bore an infantry badge that had been decommissioned in 2005, the year I myself served in Iraq. The figure didn't move, it didn't breathe, but it didn't seem solid either. It was as if every contour was shrouded in a very fine mist, almost imperceptible, but present. I felt as if I spoke a word, I might disrupt something, or awaken something that shouldn't be awakened. But I spoke anyway. My voice nearly swallowed by the wind, I murmured, "Soldier, are you waiting for orders?" At that moment he turned his face. Not completely, just enough for me to see half of a pale, firm face, and his eyes. That look wasn't that of someone dead. It was that of someone still on a mission. And if you think that's enough to keep you up at night, wait until you find out what I found when I dug into the army records, because whatever was in that coffin may never have been the real David Harper. The next day, still in shock, I decided to do what no other gravedigger would do: open the cemetery's old archives and cross-reference them with the public records of the base where David Harper had served. It wasn't easy. Military bureaucracy is designed so no one can see too much, especially civilians. But I had buried too many soldiers to accept that feeling passively. What I'd seen the night before wasn't a fantasy, and something inside me told me there had been a mistake, a grave mistake. I gained access to a secondary file containing scanned documents from the ceremony and the body's identification form, and it was there, on that cold screen in the funeral home, that the first inconsistency leaped before my eyes. The body's weight recorded on the day of burial was inconsistent, with David's height 156 pounds, but the medical reports prior to the mission clearly stated David Harper weighed 135, a difference of over 10 pounds. I continued investigating. The height didn't match either. The body delivered measured 6 feet 1 inch. David was only 5 feet 9 inches. But the worst came when I discovered how the identification was made. There was no dental analysis, no DNA test, just a dog tag found alongside human remains after an airstrike in Afghanistan. The body was charred beyond recognition. All that remained was the metal of the dog tag, partially melted, and a piece of fabric that coincidentally, or not, belonged to the same regiment as David. The army had no doubts. They sealed the coffin, handed it over to the family, and the ceremony was performed without anyone questioning anything. But now, with the data I had before me, one thing became clear. That wasn't him. And if that body wasn't David Harper's, the question that arises is even more frightening. Where is the real one? Did he die somewhere else? Was he taken? Or, and this hypothesis still gives me chills today, he never died? It was at that moment that I realized that perhaps the spirit wandering among the tombs wasn't bound by death, but by lies, an unfinished mission interrupted by a mistake, a misidentification, a coffin bearing the wrong name. Perhaps he wasn't seeking revenge. Perhaps he just needed to be recognized. But when I tried to deliver this information to the local base, something even more inexplicable happened, and what emerged from the grave days later proved that not even the truth was enough to seal that grave. Even without official answers, without authorization, and without anyone's backing, I returned to the grave. I went alone, at dusk, carrying a folded American flag and a handwritten note. With each step between the graves, I felt a different weight on my shoulders. It wasn't fear. It was something akin to responsibility. A debt that wasn't mine, but one that someone needed to pay. When I arrived, the sky was already a shade between deep blue and the grey of the dawning night. I knelt there, right in front of the headstone, placed the flag on the grave and left the note. Mission accomplished, soldier, even if no one warned you. I remained silent for a few minutes, only the sound of the wind and dry leaves sweeping between the tombstones. When I got up to leave, I had the distinct sensation that the ground had stabilized, as if the tremor, which had been with me for so many nights, had finally ceased. But what truly shook me wasn't the silence. It was what I found the next day, when I reviewed the security camera audio that, instinctively, I'd left recording that morning. In the last minutes of the recording, a muffled noise echoes amidst the sound of the wind. It is the sound of rhythmic steps, heavy, like combat boots, hitting wet grass. The audio ends at exactly 3:15, with the sound receding, as if someone were finally leaving the station or being transferred. Since that day, David Harper's grave has never trembled. Not a flag has been touched, not a flower has been moved, but something tells me he's still around, not as before, but as someone who watched me and chose me. And if you think that was the only time a soldier refused to rest, wait until you hear what happened in Tomb 47. Because in that place, death doesn't end the mission, it just changes the form of command. Nighttime burials are rare, and when they do happen, it's because something's wrong. That night in Charleston was muggy, moonless, with a strange wind that made the branches seem to whisper to each other. I had already finished my shift when I received a call from management. A family demanded that the burial take place immediately. It was urgent, religious, unavoidable. I accepted without much thought, but all it took was seeing the hearse approaching through the side gate to know I'd made a mistake. The coffin was white, impeccably white, decorated with plastic lilies and satin bows, the kind of coffin you only see at brides' wakes or children's. 3 people got out of the car: the mother, an older man, probably the father, and the driver. No tears, no words, just her name scrawled at the top of the funeral record: Eliza May, 23 years old. They said she would be married the following week, that she died suddenly, and that she should be buried in her wedding dress, under the light of night. The grave was closed hastily, without prayers, without candles, and it was just after the last handful of earth that it happened. A thick mist rose from the grave, white, cold, and dense. It didn't come from the ground. It came out from within of the coffin. And that was just the beginning of what I witnessed that morning. I drove home that night trying to convince myself the fog was just steam, condensation, or some common phenomenon my exhaustion had transformed into a ghost. But no. Matter how much I lay down, closed my eyes, or remained silent, the image of that white smoke rising from the grave returned with a clarity impossible to ignore. At 3 a.m, I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and drove back to the cemetery. Something kept pulling me back there, not with fear, but as if someone was still waiting for me. The gate was unlocked. There was no sign of a break-in. Everything was as I'd left it. But as I began to walk down the central aisle of tombstones, I noticed a silhouette in the distance, a white figure standing among the tombs in the west wing. It looked like a woman. Her back was turned. Her veil covered her head down to her heels and trailed along the ground. But the strangest thing wasn't seeing her there. What was most disturbing was noticing that the veil didn't move with the wind. Everything around fluttered. The leaves danced. But that fabric, even as light as lace, seemed stuck in mid-air, as if trapped between two worlds. I began walking slowly, trying to get a better look. I hid behind a weathered angel statue and watched. The figure walked slowly among the graves. It didn't float. It stepped. It moved like a real person. But when it passed under the beam of light from an old street lamp I saw, there was no face, only a dark stain beneath the veil, as if something had burned where features should have been. She stood before Eliza's newly filled grave, bowed her head slightly, and then, without warning, simply dissolved into the darkness. She didn't evaporate, it disappeared. I walked home in silence, but something inside me knew I wasn't hallucinating. That night, a bride who had never walked down the aisle walked among the dead. But what awaited me the next morning would prove that the burial didn't end when the last shovel of earth fell on the coffin. I arrived at the cemetery early that morning. The sun had barely risen, and a thin mist covered the ground like a wet blanket. My body was present, but my mind still stuck in the image of that figure. I walked straight to Eliza's grave. From a distance, something seemed strange. The earth over the grave, which had been carefully leveled the night before, was no irregular, as if something had pushed from the inside out, looked recent. There were no footprints, no sign of trespassing, just a slight elevation, right over the center of the grave. I got closer and noticed a crack in the newly installed marble headstone, a thin but deep crack, one that hadn't been there the night before. I bent down to touch it and felt the cold stone vibrate, not like an earthquake, but as if something down there had left invisible marks of its presence. I didn't think twice. I called the funeral director and asked for permission to reopen the grave, citing the risk of soil settling. He resisted, but eventually relented. As the helpers removed the slab and excavated the coffin, I felt the air change. The smell wasn't rotten. It was acidic. The coffin lid was cracked inside, with small splinters of wood pushing out, as if something had pressed hard against the top. When we carefully opened it, what we saw stopped us in our tracks. The white silk lining was scratched, as if fingernails had scraped both sides, and there was a dark, almost black stain right on the front of the dress. The body was still there. Eliza hadn't disappeared, but something was different. Her eyes weren't completely closed. The lids were slightly open, and her mouth, once serene, now showed a tense space between her lips, as if she had tried to scream. The team walked away in silence. No one said anything, but I understood. That woman, I didn't want to be there. And someone put her in that white dress against her will. And it was exactly when I began to investigate who she was in life that the signs became even more disturbing. I spent the next 2 days trying to understand who Eliza May was beyond the cold notes in the funeral home. Young, 23, born and raised right there in Charleston, an only child, no relevant medical history. The cause of death listed was domestic accident, nothing more. No details, no accompanying medical report. I went to City Hall, searched local newspaper archives, obituaries, public records, and the truth began to emerge, slowly, fragmentarily, but increasingly disturbing. I found a newspaper article published only online, with few views. Bride loses her life days before wedding. Tragedy shakes. Community. There were no details about the accident, but it did mention that the wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday. One name appeared as the groom, Robert Fenwick, 32 years old, local businessman, successful, discreet, very religious. I contacted the registry office and requested access to the documents. I obtained a copy of the marriage certificate, but with a surprising detail, it had been filed with a cancellation request signed by Eliza 2 days before her death. Something didn't add up. If she had called off the wedding, Why was she buried in her wedding dress? Why was the funeral ceremony held at night under the guise of the family's wishes? I returned to the funeral home and found an envelope that had been left on the day of the funeral. A diary, old, leather-bound. It belonged to Eliza. No one wanted to keep it. I opened it carefully. The last pages contained short sentences, as if written in a hurry. They forced me. I don't want to wear white. This dress suffocates me. If I die before then, know that I tried to run away. My breath caught as I read the last entry. If I say no now, they'll bury me as if I'd said yes. I closed the diary and leaned back in the reception chair, feeling my stomach churn. Eliza wasn't buried as a bride by choice, was condemned to play the role she so feared. The dress wasn't a tribute, it was a punishment. And when I returned to the cemetery the next morning to reflect, something completely froze me. The security camera installed the week before had recorded a visitor at midnight. It was the groom, Robert, alone, standing before the grave. But beside him appeared again the figure covered by the white veil. The recording ends with him turning to her. A movement, and the image fades. The next morning, Robert was gone, and to this day, no one knows where he was buried, if he was buried at all. But what I found on the tombstone a few days later proved that Eliza hadn't given up on being heard. Yet, that night I didn't return to the cemetery as a gravedigger. I returned as someone who had been dragged into the grief of a stranger. Something inside me told me that Eliza wouldn't rest while she was trapped in that white dress, in that forced role, in that farce disguised as a tribute. I went to the morgue, grabbed a black veil used in old-fashioned wakes, and from home I brought a simple, dark blue dress that belonged to my late wife. It was just fabric, I know, but it carried the energy of someone who had been truly loved and never forced to love anyone. Arriving at the grave, I folded everything carefully and left it on the headstone. I didn't pray. I didn't speak. I simply bowed my head, as if apologizing for not having done so sooner. The night passed in silence. No apparitions, no mist, nothing. But the next day, when I returned, both objects were gone. And even stranger, the grave looked different. The earth was compact, firm. The crack in the headstone had closed. With the early morning dew, there was no longer any tension in the air. It was as if, for the first time, Eliza had been heard. I walked to the north sector for my routine rounds and found something that stopped me in my tracks. On an old headstone, a few meters from Eliza's grave, sat a small, light-colored wooden box. Inside were 2 aged wedding rings and a handwritten note. Now I can rest. They finally said no to me. I closed the box with trembling hands and felt that this story had somehow been brought to an end, not by the justice of the living, but by the surrender of those who never had the right to decide. Since then, no one has seen the bride again. No veils, no shadows, no nocturnal perfumes. But there's one thing no one can explain. In the north wing, at 3 in the morning, the scent of jasmine still lingers, even when there are no flowers around, and the newly sealed tomb belongs to another woman, young, beautiful, and wearing a wedding dress that should never have been worn. Some nights at the cemetery are just silence and boredom. Others begin with a feeling of foreboding that stays with you until the end. That's how that shift began. The sky was cloudy, the wind cutting through the surrounding pine trees, and a damp smell of wet earth that seemed stronger than usual. I'd been assigned to cover the early morning hours, as I had so many times before, and everything would have been under control, if not for the presence of that small white coffin that appeared in the chapel before midnight. It was the size of a child. Just looking at it made my chest tighten. I didn't even need to read the label to understand. And yet, I went over there. The name stamped in the corner of the paper was Dylan Hayes, 8 years old, death by accident at home. No one went into details, and maybe it was for the best. The kind of thing we'd rather not know. The undertaker left the body there and left too quickly, as if trying to rid himself of something still clinging to. The coffin was closed, but the atmosphere wasn't. There was something in the room, a silence that wasn't silence, you know. It was a sensation, as if someone were breathing in there right along with me, as if the air was filled with more than oxygen. I tried to follow protocol, placing the flowers, lighting a small candle in the corner, and leaving a chair for the family, even though I knew no one would be coming that night. The child's mother had said she couldn't bear to see the body again. But what I didn't know was that perhaps she was right to avoid that sight, because later that night, something in that room would challenge everything I believed possible. And it was exactly at the moment I decided to take one last look at the chapel that the laughter began. At first I thought it was the wind, that strange whistling sound that sometimes slips through cracks and produces sounds that fool even those who've worked with death for years. But it wasn't, because the sound that echoed through that chapel wasn't natural. It had intonation, it had rhythm. It was like a child trying to contain its laughter in that muffled, mischievous way, as if it were doing something hidden from everyone. My muscles locked. I was alone, with the gate key still in my pocket and the security radio muted by choice. I'd always preferred silence. But that night, the silence became a trap. Laughter, soft at first, echoed among the chapel's empty pews, a sound too sweet for the context. Too wrong to be there. My eyes roamed every corner, expecting to see someone, anything, but the room was as empty as ever. Just the coffin, the flowers, and that pew in the corner, its upholstery still torn. I took a deep breath and walked to the side, trying to convince myself that maybe it was some electronic toy left by mistake. But there was nothing. Just this growing feeling that I was being watched, not from afar, up close, from within. And it was at that moment that I noticed a tiny, but significant change. The coffin, the small white coffin, was no longer completely closed. The lid, which had previously been tightly fitted, now had a crack. Just a tiny crack, 1/2 centimeter perhaps, but enough to make it unbearable to ignore. I approached with small steps, feeling the weight of the air increase with every inch. And when I touched my fingers to the side of the lid, something made me stop. The laughter had stopped. The chapel plunged into a silence so dense it felt alive, as if the room held its breath along with me. And in that moment, before I even had the courage to open the lid further, I noticed something even more disturbing. The eyes, the boy's eyes, were open, fixed, glazed, and they seemed to see me. Not symbolically, but truly, directly, almost inquisitively. But the most terrifying thing in this was yet to come, because it was when I looked out the side window that I noticed something small moving in the shadows outside. Outside the window, fogged by the early morning humidity, something moved with the subtlety of a breath, but with the presence of a threat. Among the cypress trees surrounding the chapel, there was a silhouette, small, disproportionate to the surroundings, but perfectly visible even in the gloom that enveloped the entire grounds. I can't explain why, but I had no doubt it was the figure of a child. And the worst part was that it wasn't running or walking. It just stood there, standing, watching. The feeling was that the figure had emerged from its own coffin, passed through walls, broken logic, and was now looking at me from a place inaccessible to human eyes. For a moment, I considered leaving, walking around the cemetery, checking for a lost child, a grotesque mistake, an absurd coincidence. But deep down, something told me it would be pointless. That wasn't a child. It was something that merely resembled one, something that knew my every step before I even decided to take it. I backed away from the window slowly, as if any sudden movement might provoke a reaction. The boy's body still lay there, motionless, his eyes now half closed, as if they had never been open. The coffin, mysteriously, was closed again. Nothing made sense anymore. I felt a shiver run down my spine and had to hold on tightly to the back of the bench next to me to keep from falling. I wasn't dealing with an ordinary death. I was facing something that crossed the line between the physical and the invisible, between what is buried and what refuses to go away. And it was at that moment that I heard the sound again. It wasn't laughter this time. It was a drawn-out whisper, muffled by the window, but audible enough to chill the blood. A short sentence, emotionless, but full of purpose. "I'm still here." I swallowed hard, not daring to open the door. I turned instinctively to look at the window again. But the silhouette was gone. What remained was an impression that something or someone had entered and was now inside the chapel. I've never been one to be easily impressed. Decades of working in cemeteries have taught me that our minds play tricks when the night stretches on beyond what's acceptable. But that early morning, everything seemed intentional, as if an invisible presence were coordinating every noise, every shadow, every uncomfortable sensation that made my body tremble inside. When I returned to the chapel after the silhouette had disappeared, the atmosphere had changed. It was as if the space were contaminated with something unseen, but which made the air almost unbreathable. The dim candlelight flickered strangely, as if reacting to an invisible presence. That's when I noticed a detail that had, until then, gone unnoticed. A small blue friction cart discreetly positioned next to the makeshift altar. No one had placed it there. The coffin was closed. The body was still. The room had been sealed off since the beginning of the shift. I approached slowly, trying to rationalize, trying not to give in to the spiral of thoughts already screaming inside my head. And then, before my eyes, the cart moved. First, a small push, then a subtle twist, as if someone were testing it. But there was no wind, no tremor. There was only the sound of wheels scraping the floor and a cold certainty that paralyzed me. I was no longer alone. Whatever it was playing with me, literally, and it wasn't satisfied with my attempt to ignore it. It was as if that presence wanted to be recognized, noticed, welcomed, as every child desires, even after death. Suddenly, a small ball rolled under the bench. Then, a teddy bear fell from the top of the shelf, as if pushed by invisible hands. None of those toys had been there when I started my shift. And the most disturbing thing was that they all seemed turned toward me. The dolls sewn in eyes, the smile painted on the bear's face, all fixed, inert, yet frighteningly alive with intent. I tried to leave the room. I tried, but something stopped me. Not physically, but mentally. I felt like if I walked away, something much worse would happen. And it was at that moment that I heard once again that same whisper, but this time, coming from inside the coffin. It took me a few seconds to convince myself to approach the coffin again. The atmosphere was heavy, as if time itself had slowed down. The sound of my own heartbeat began to drown out any external noise, even the muffled laughter that seemed to be lost within the chapel walls. With firm steps but a hesitant heart, I approached the innocent white wooden structure, as if that were enough to mask what lay within. The coffin lid was still ajar, just as I'd seen before. But this time, there was something different. It was barely perceptible, but there was a strange warmth in the air, as if the death inside hadn't finished its journey. I took a deep breath. I leaned in, and when I looked, the child's eyes were open, not wide, not glassy, open as if they were aware, observing, recognizing me. The shock was paralyzing. I couldn't scream, I couldn't run. I stood there staring into that empty yet strangely present gaze, as if that boy were studying me from within, as if waiting for a specific reaction, a gesture, a word, something I never knew how to give to children in life, and now not even in death. It was at that moment that he blinked. Yes, he blinked, slowly, as if to say, "I know you're watching." And then, right after, the voice, low, weak, coming from somewhere I couldn't identify. It didn't come from his mouth, I'm sure of that, but it was clear, and it said, "You left me here." The phrase reverberated within me like an ancient echo, as if it weren't just about that night or that body, but about everything, about all the forgotten, those who left alone, those who never had anyone to return. The child said nothing more, and when I looked again, the eyes were closed, as if they had never opened. I left the chapel that night feeling like something had been broken, like a barrier had been breached, not between me and the boy, but between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Since then, I've never been able to hear children's laughter without feeling a shiver run down my spine. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear that same phrase, but said in a different voice. There are nights when the silence weighs differently, as if even the earth were harboring a secret it doesn't want revealed. That night, the sky was clear, moonless, windless. Only the sound of my own footsteps and the clink of the shovel against the dry ground accompanied me. It was around 2 in the morning when I began digging the new grave in the north section of the cemetery. An old, almost forgotten area where we only bury people without family, without visitors, without names. The kind of place where even the grass seems to grow in silence. With each blow against the ground, something inside me felt more alert, as if my senses had awakened to something that wasn't yet there, but was about to manifest. As I reached a deeper layer of earth, the sound of the shovel changed. From a hollow, dry sound, it became something more muffled, almost humid. I found it strange. I bent down to check, even thinking I might have hit a thick root or some kind of animal. But what came wasn't a smell nor a movement. It was a sound, a scream. But it wasn't a normal scream. It was muffled as if it had been swallowed by the ground before reaching my ears, and yet it made me take 2 steps back. The sound wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was something in between, a sound laden with despair, as if someone had been buried, alive. My heart raced. Sweat ran down my back despite the night chill. And it was at that moment that I realized the sound wasn't coming from the grave I was digging. It was coming from another, from a grave that, according to all records, had not been disturbed since 1942. I stood there, frozen for a few seconds, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was the sound of an animal. Maybe the earth was giving way under the weight of ancient roots. But nothing made sense. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, as it had done before. After all, anyone who works in a cemetery learns early on to ignore what their eyes think they saw or what their ears swear they heard. But in that moment, what I heard next surpassed any limits of suggestion or madness, because after the muffled scream came something even more frightening. A whisper. A low, drawn-out whisper coming from the depths of the same forgotten grave. Only this time it spoke my name, not once, but 3 times, with an intonation that seemed to greet and curse at the same time. The voice was hoarse, moist, as if the lungs that released it were still filled with dirt and worms. And most disturbing, it was a female voice, recognizable but impossible to place, as if it were someone who had spoken to me before, but long ago. I walked over to the old grave, the one the records marked NGI, no one identified. It was a shallow grave with a headstone bearing no name, no birth date, just a corroded cross and the date November 12th, 1942. The earth around it was disturbed, loose, recently disturbed. I bent down carefully, touched the surface, and noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The wood of the coffin, beneath the thin layer of earth, was damp, as if someone had been sweating inside, or crying. I stopped. I stood up slowly, and it was at that moment that I felt clearly, as if someone were pressed against my right shoulder, a warm breath. There was no wind, no breeze, but there was air touching me. And then a second voice spoke, softer, closer, as if it were inside my own head. He said, "You're back, as you promised." I didn't understand. I hadn't come back from anywhere. I hadn't made any promises. But that voice spoke to me intimately, with a frightening certainty, as if it had known me in a life I'd never lived, as if I'd done something and simply forgotten or erased it. And it was at this point that I began to feel the most distressing sensation of all, that it wasn't me who was listening to the dead, but that it was they who had waited so long to speak to me. And they weren't going to stop there. The night passed in an almost solid silence, the kind that seems to press against your ears, drowning out even the sound of your own heartbeat. And yet, as much as I wanted to get out of there was something about that grave that held me, as if the earth itself were alive. It wasn't fear that held me. It was a strange feeling of déjà vu, a memory that wasn't mine, but that I felt as if it were. I walked back to the backhoe, never taking my eyes off that spot. And as I turned to walk away, I swear by all that is holy, the earth above the ancient grave shifted. It wasn't a sudden movement, nor could it be attributed to the wind or the weight of the ground giving way. It was subtle, a slow sinking, as if someone down there had turned over, as if a body were trying to find a more comfortable position within a space where comfort was unavailable. I approached again and noticed that the center of the grave was cracked. The earth was splitting in thin lines like a web of cracked glass, and right in the middle, a small opening began to appear. Instinctively, and perhaps foolishly, I picked up the shovel and dug lightly, removing only the top layer, almost as if I were trying to confirm that it was just my impression. But what appeared there, beneath the first layer of damp earth, was a piece of aged wood, waterlogged and covered in fungus. It was the coffin lid, only it wasn't closed. The center was arched upward, bulging, as if something had pressed in. I ran my fingers over the surface and noticed marks, nail marks, many, some short and deep, others long, almost desperate, dragging toward the center of the lid. A pattern that made it clear this wasn't simple rot or erosion. This was someone trying to get out. My stomach lurched. I dropped the shovel to the ground, took a deep breath, and took 2 steps back. The smell rising from the cracked wood was sweet and putrid at the same time, like decaying flowers. And then, once again, I heard it. This time, it wasn't a whisper nor a muffled scream. It was a scratching, high-pitched sound that seemed to be made by the wood itself being scratched from within. 3 knocks, sharp, spaced, as if someone down there still had the strength or the will to get out. And it was at that moment that a doubt began to eat away at what was left of my sanity. Had whatever was there really died one day, or had it simply been buried before its time? I could have walked away. I could have left. Everything as it was, pretended I hadn't seen, hadn't heard, that night was just another one of many I spent alone in that cemetery, forgotten by God and the living. But something held me back. A mixture of morbid fascination and a fear that didn't paralyze. It just beckoned. I returned to the spot where the knocking had stopped. I stood there, as if waiting for the sound to repeat itself, as if deep down I wanted to hear it again to make sure I wasn't going crazy. And then it came. First, As a scratch, then as a whisper, faint but precise, as if it had passed through the earth, the coffin, death itself. It was my voice, but not spoken by me. Someone was calling my name, repeating it, slowly, syllable by syllable, as if savoring each letter, as if each repetition were a way of opening an invisible door. And that was when I felt it. Not a wind, not a touch, but a presence. It was as if the darkness itself had gained weight, as if the air had grown denser and each breath required more effort. I looked around but saw no one. Yet inside my head, something had been activated. Images appeared, flashes of memories that weren't mine. A man in a dark suit, a woman kneeling before a grave, a child crying softly behind a twisted tree. Old scenes. Scenes from another time, but all somehow connected to that tomb. I began to back away, not running, but walking backward, as if unwilling to turn their back on something they don't understand. And it was in that movement that something shone beside me. A broken piece of mirror reflected the cemetery entrance, and there I saw it, a silhouette standing between the tombstones, motionless, long, slender, her face obscured by the shadow of her hood. Except the most terrifying detail was that she was also looking back at me through the reflection. My body froze. I blinked, and she disappeared. I looked around. Nothing. But the sound, the whisper, it didn't stop. On the contrary, it grew clearer and clearer, as if it were getting closer, as if the earth were bringing someone back, someone who knew my name, my story, and who, for some reason I still don't understand, was waiting for me. Because what came next was the invitation, a call, a warning, and it wasn't just for me. The next morning, the sun didn't rise with the same force. The sky was dull, almost grey, and even the sounds of the birds seemed muffled, as if nature had chosen to remain silent in the face of what had happened that morning. I returned to the spot where I'd heard the screams. It was an old grave, nameless, flowerless, with no sign of recent visitors. But something was different. The earth, which I'd seen compact the night before, was now disturbed, as if it had been dug from the inside out. And worst of all was what was revealed amidst the damp earth. The coffin, old and cracked, was partially exposed. The rotted wood couldn't hide the marks inside. They were scratches, many of them, deep gashes, as if someone had struggled desperately to get out. My hands were shaking, but I approached anyway, not out of courage because I no longer had any. It was as if something was pulling me, as if I needed to see, needed confirmation. And there, on the corner of the chipped lid, was something written with a fingernail. 3 words. I'm still here. I jerked away, feeling the weight of it fall upon me. It wasn't just the story of a body buried 80 years ago. It was a consciousness, a name erased, a presence trapped in invisible cycles, trying with each generation to be heard, to be seen, to be freed. And everything indicated that now it was my turn to listen. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my routine, feign normalcy, digging more graves as if they were just holes. But every time I approached that area, something happened. The earth moved on its own, even without wind. The wood creaked softly, as if breathing. And sometimes on the quietest nights, I heard footsteps, not animals, not people, but footsteps coming from beneath the earth, as if someone were walking among the dead. I even reported this to the cemetery manager. He laughed, as many do, as if he'd heard such stories before, but preferred not to believe them so he could sleep peacefully. But I couldn't sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my name whispered. And with it came memories that weren't mine. Dreams that showed faces from times I'd never lived, including that of a woman. She wept silently before an unmarked headstone, and when she turned, She had my eyes. She had my pain. Today, I write this account not as a warning, nor as a rant, but as a way to anchor what sanity I have left, because something was opened that night, something that wasn't meant to be touched, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't by chance. Maybe I have some connection to that voice, to that coffin, to that forgotten name, or maybe I'm just next. But if you ever pass by a rural cemetery in northern Tennessee and hear someone softly calling your name, please do not answer. Some people are born with a broken clock inside their chest, the kind who never stops, not even when the silence of dawn calls for rest. Charles D. Moore was that kind of man, a tireless worker at Miller County Memorial Cemetery in southern Georgia. Gravedigger, embalmer, headstone restorer, night caretaker, Charles did it all, literally. And he never complained. Ever. Not even when his knees began to creak like old wood, not even when his eyes could no longer see the names on the headstones. So, clearly, he was the first to arrive, and almost always the last to leave. The town respected him. Some said he was the cemetery's guardian. Others, more superstitious, preferred to keep their distance, claiming that Charles talked to himself while digging, as if conversing with the dead. I witnessed this myself once, and I swear the tone of the conversation was serious, respectful, as if asking permission before touching the ground. They say every man has a falling moment. Charles's was ironic and cruel. He died exactly where he spent most of his life, in the embalming room, alone, on the graveyard shift. While preparing a body for the next day's burial, his heart simply stopped. And for some reason no one could explain, the alarm button that should have alerted the emergency team didn't work. They found him slumped beside the stainless steel table, his hands still clad in inspection gloves. His eyes were half open, as if he were still observing some technical detail, as if he were checking something. The news shook us all. Not because it was unexpected he was old enough to stop, but because it seemed impossible to imagine that cemetery without him. And maybe we didn't even need to imagine it, because it was from that night on that things began to change there, small, almost imperceptible signs. At first. But how to explain what happened in the following nights, when Charles's absence began to feel like presence? The first night after Charles's burial was incredibly silent, and working in a rural cemetery, you learn to value silence. But this was no ordinary silence, not the serene kind that lulls one's thoughts while sweeping a lane or turning off the last lights in a shed. It was an unsettling silence, pressing on the ears and making the heart race for no reason. And it was in this strange emptiness that the first thing happened. I'd gone back to the maintenance room to get my gloves. The door was ajar, something I always locked out of. Habit. Inside, the fluorescent light flickered constantly, as if it were failing, even though it was new. The thing is, no one had been in there since Charles's wake, which, incidentally, had been held in that very space as a tribute. The wreath of flowers drying in the corner and the framed black and white photo of him smiling were still there. An image that, I swear to God, seemed to stare back at me with even more intensity that night. As I crossed the room to get the gloves, I heard a metallic sound, soft but distinct. It was the click of a flashlight, one of those inspection lights Charles used to inspect coffins before burial. The light flickered in the back of the shed, alone, pointing directly at the cabinet where he usually stored his materials. I thought someone was there. I called out. No answer. As I approached, the flashlight went out on its own. And the strangest thing, it wasn't on. It had no batteries. I didn't mention it to anyone that night. I thought it might be stress or just my head playing tricks. But over the next few nights, other lanterns began to turn on their own, always at the same time, between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m. the exact window of time Charles made his final rounds at the cemetery. I knew this because I'd worked with him for years. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a pattern, a ritual that seemed to continue even after death. But it was when we found one of the freshly buried coffins with its lid partially raised that everything changed. And what was inside wasn't what we expected. That morning began like any other. Grey skies, a biting wind, and the same smell of wet earth mixed with wilted chrysanthemums. But upon arriving at the north end of the cemetery, where the most recent burials had taken place, something immediately caught my attention. One of the graves, newly closed just 2 days ago, had visibly disturbed soil. Not as if someone had dug hard, but as if the earth had heaved from within, as if something had pushed from within. I approached cautiously, trying to convince myself it was just a sign of the early morning rain. But it wasn't. The sides were cracked, and there was something even stranger. The coffin lid, partially raised, exposed only a crack. That opening seemed intentional, as if someone simply wanted to peek in. The most disturbing part, however, came when we used the tools to carefully remove the wooden structure. The coffin, inside, was intact, except for the marks. Marks that shouldn't have been there. Gloves, glove marks, impressions made with a light layer of whitish dust, as if left by someone wearing thick fabric gloves, the same kind Charles wore during his inspections. But the most disturbing thing was noticing the pattern. These were no ordinary marks. They were organized in pairs, always focused on the inner corners, as if whoever was there was checking every detail of the lining, the joints, the lid, exactly as Charles did before any burial. It was the methodical gesture of a professional who, even after death, seemed incapable of abandoning his work. There was no sign of external tampering, no shovels used, no traces of animals or vandals. And even if there had been, how to explain the internal marks? How to explain the fact that everything pointed to an activity that only someone skilled in the art could perform with such precision? And that night, when I returned to the office to document the incident, I found something that made me freeze inside. On my desk lay a single glove, one of Charles's, smeared with fresh dirt. But the other was still missing, and it appeared to still be in use. That same night, tension accumulated in my chest like a thick fog that wouldn't lift with a sigh. After recording what had happened, I decided to return to the old embalming shed, the same one where Charles spent the last minutes of his life. Something was pulling me there. I don't know if it was guilt, longing, or simply the need to face what I'd been avoiding since that damn day. I entered alone, the dim flashlight trembling between my fingers, the creaking of the door echoing like a distorted memory of the past. The smell was the same, a mixture of formaldehyde, dried flowers, and something metallic like old rust. The stretcher where he fell was still there, covered by a thick sheet that seemed to carry his presence. But that wasn't what paralyzed me inside. It was the sound, a dry crack coming from the back. A wall where the cabinets containing the tools and old records were. I approached with heavy, cautious steps and noticed that one of the drawers was ajar. Inside it, the other glove, the missing one. But that wasn't all. Beside her was a notebook, the same one where Charles kept meticulous notes on each body he prepared. Only now, there was a new page written, in his handwriting, recent date, full name, time of arrival, cause of death. Everything filled out perfectly, except for one detail. The name written was mine, and the date was the following day. I swallowed hard. The paper didn't look old. It was clean, aligned, freshly laid. The ink was still wet. It was as if someone had just written it, or rather, as if Charles was still there, fulfilling what he always said jokingly, As long as I have strength in my hands, no one leaves this cemetery without passing through me. I stumbled out of there, gasping for air, as if the air had grown heavier. But before I could cross the threshold, I heard it, a shuffle of feet. Slow, methodical, exactly how Charles walked when he came from the back of the warehouse, ready for another day of work. And in that moment I understood that maybe he had never really left. The next morning, before the sun had even broken through the thick fog shrouding the cemetery, I returned to the site with a supervisor. I needed a witness, some concrete sign that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. But as always happens with those who carry truths no one wants to hear, nothing seemed out of place. The notebook was gone, the drawers were locked, the gloves, both of them, hung on the same old hook Charles used. There were no traces, no scratches, no smell of fresh formaldehyde. Only silence, heavy as the guilt of someone who survives when the other had no choice. Even so, something had changed. The lanterns, previously off, now came on every night, even without a power outage. The warehouse gate, previously stuck, now opened and closed. On its own, with a creak that mimicked the slow, weary breathing of someone who should have rested. But what tormented me most wasn't what could be seen or heard. It was what I felt, a kind of constant vigilance, as if someone were always there, watching from afar, making sure everything was in order. After so many years dealing with death, I thought I'd seen it all. But this experience taught me that what weighs most heavily on a man's soul is not the fear of what comes next, but what's left behind. Charles didn't return for revenge. He returned out of routine, out of a sense of duty, because he believed his role was more important than death itself. And maybe, just maybe, he's still there, walking silently among the graves, checking every name, every date, every coffin latch, just as he did when he was alive. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you felt this calling. Perhaps because you, like me, know that some stories don't end when the last shovel of dirt covers the coffin. So, if you want to continue hearing the stories the world insists on burying, subscribe to the channel now, because the voices from the cemetery still have much to say, and you won't want to miss the next whisper.